最当做给穷囊了，将就把多囊的给足起，大给去年级别从囊给着了，本节上给主包数，给九千块多张，主要的是。你的肩膀的上天心多米的我也，若给那那些那就把说啥是本有本是没有啊，internet maybe not so good. Maybe internet is yeah, you're not connecting, is it? Okay. And you're using Deco or yeah, Deco. We try. So if still unstable, then maybe need to reconnect. Yeah. And, no. 无聊的东西，肯定我就是接不住。我等我现在自己比较短，你看到去的地方比去的多。我大家我年纪知道，就当身体慢慢去更新的，就是妈妈这个比较慢些吧，当然这个이제 좀 만드는 대화가 되잖아. 지금 그런 거 신경 이가 이건 이제 만드는 대화 비디오 비슷한 대화를 비디오 비슷하고 좀만 그러니까 좀만 비슷하게 tema 규칙과 음성이나 So please adjust your sitting posture according to the 7 meditative postures of Vairocana. All sentient beings have been my mothers. All sentient beings have been my mothers, not just once, but for numberless times. They are as kind as my mothers in this life. All kind mother sentient beings want happiness and do not want even a small suffering. However, due to engaging wrongly with objects of adoptions and objects of abandonment, they only experience suffering. In our minds, instantly generate loving kindness towards all kind mother sentient beings, thinking, how nice it would be if all kind mother sentient beings were to have causes of happiness. How nice it would be if all kind mother sentient beings were to have happiness and the causes of happiness that is virtue. And
May they have happiness and the causes of happiness. I will cause them to have happiness and the causes of happiness. Lama, please bless me to be able to do so. So in these cultivations of loving kindness contains four immeasurables as well. And the first immeasurable is the immeasurable aspiration, which starts with how nice it would be. And the second one is immeasurable prayer or immeasurable supplication. So it starts with, may they have happiness and the causes of happiness. And the third one is immeasurable special pure attitude. And it starts with, I will cause them to have happiness and the causes of happiness. And the last one, it says, Lama, please bless me to be able to do so. This shows the immeasurable requests.
就是我呢，就是我的那些，旅行的那种用啊，现在我老说的旅行的，的确，他那个讲嘛，去到那个像我的前面老妈来去的那个是的，什么想法基本讲的。
Yeah. So I correct myself. The first one is immeasurable aspiration. And the second one, it would be better to translate it as immeasurable wish. The third one is immeasurable special pure attitude. And the fourth one is immeasurable request or supplication. So next, we cultivate compassion towards all suffering mother sentient beings, thinking, how nice it would be if the bodies of all suffering mother sentient beings were free from all discordant factors with accomplishing virtues. Such as sickness and problems caused by four elements. May they be free from, may their bodies be free from discordant factors or discordant class with accomplishing virtue. Or cause their bodies to be free from the discordant classes with accomplishing virtue. Lama, please bless me to be able to do so. Similarly, these cultivations of compassion contains four immeasurables, as I mentioned just now.
동아지나 이제 만드는 미션이 잡아 그러니까 남도 잘하는 하고 좀 지금 저 다비서 어디로 제일 받아 말에 시주는
How nice it would be if the minds of all suffering mother sentient beings were free from the class discordant with accomplishing virtue, such as fear, anxiety, mental suffering, and coarse and negative, coarse and subtle thoughts or discursive thoughts. May their minds be free from the discordant class, or cause their minds to be free from the discordant class. Lama, please bless me to be able to do so.
이게 이제 동아지나 이제 좀 만드는 지금
How nice beings were free from the class discordant with accomplishing virtue, such as those negative speech. May their speech be free from the discordant class, or free their speech from the discordant class. Lama, please bless me to be able to do so.
Music, the watching at the mountain, goes into the show, people are making to color to the tumor. Watch you talk about the machine, so do some
How nice it would be if the three doors of all suffering mother sentient beings were free from all classes discordant with accomplishing virtue. May their three doors be free from all discordant class. I'll cause their three doors to be free from discordant class. Lama, please bless me to be able to do so.
which is the ordinary somebody that the way that the way you do give what that turn to what you draw up so the same
How nice it would be if all mother sentient beings were free from suffering and the causes of suffering that are non-virtues. May they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. I will free them from suffering and the causes of suffering. Lama, please bless me to be able to do so.
which is the ordinary somebody that they call them so all the so you're on up that didn't ever see other to be something to compare with when person yanda wa the something like c'est 30 de something to compare with the proportion
Next, we cultivate bodhicitta. First, we ask ourselves, who should take on the responsibility to free all mother sentient beings from the sufferings of samsara, and in particular, three lower realms? I should take on the responsibility to free all mother sentient beings from the sufferings of samsara and three lower realms in particular. Even though I should take on the responsibility, I do not have the ability to do so now. Who has such abilities? Only those who have achieved the perfect, complete enlightenment have the abilities to do so. Therefore, for the sake of all mother sentient beings, by all means, I will achieve the state of enlightenment.
就是生前团体的上去恐怕都往小那是工作问题，他们那个在一起我是被他把接了就接上去了，因为都把你的那个社会级的就给他们强制性，他们那个在一起我对一定的多几个，这个被他把接的就是你啥都是那个就长期那种的生计意思。
Next, we generate all-encompassing yoga mind, aspiring conventional bodhicitta that thinks, for the sake of all mother sentient beings, I will achieve the state of enlightenment. These transform into a mundis, a complete mundis. And the ultimate bodhicitta that is one's mind becoming in one taste with emptiness, the lack of inherent resistance. These transform into a white five-pronged vajra on top of the mundis.
第一就是到通过的让一记得特点，到通过的让这个记得特点，刚才要么这个让一去到有啥，
I does not exist as inherently one with, nor inherently different from the aggregates. Thus, I do not exist inherently.
到通过的让一记得嘛，到通过的让一记得住了，看他的对面就记得住，也说啥，让一记得，啥都是我这个事。在他的对面就记得住不是，到通过的让一记得住了，看他的对面就记得住，也就是说啥，那到通过的让一记得住。
I does not exist as inherently one with the aggregates, because if I were existed one with as one, if I were existed as inherently one with the aggregates, it would follow that I and the aggregates would become partless one or inseparable one. So because of this reason, I does not exist as inherently one with the aggregates.
你是到通过的容易他这种东西，到通过的容易他这个主呢，跟人们电影差不多到后面，人们电影差不多是20几个小时。
And meditate on the point that I does not exist as inherently different from the aggregates. If I existed inherently different from the aggregates, then it will follow that I and the aggregate would become unrelatedly different.
那就是跟我讲的，也是这，他这个上就是怎么搞的？你记得他强调哪讲的？对，就是
发现主义过来。
原来出现的前的话，原来这个的现在都是在团体，那么这个上啊，对，上面帮助我就是。
Set motivation. For the sake of all mother sentient beings, I will achieve the state of enlightenment. For this, I will listen to the teachings on Lam Rim and practice accordingly in order to benefit sentient beings.
Oh yeah, thank you. 谢谢。那这老少吧了，什么的，就是两家问题呢，我的寻求的程度上就是罢了，人家问题当中起来的。 대화 상보다 처먹이 배 나랑게 당시 처먹이 배 경제다 라미까지 먼저 창조가 되게 둘이 중요하다 싫어하게 대화 상보다 가고 싫어 예스 참고
So in this new in this new year, so we are studying our new classes this year. So we are very fortunate to be able to continue to study Lam Rim. So all these are due to the great kindness of our Lama and also the commitments that we have with the Lama.
너 사바 사마게 ሼ라 사바지 ሼ라 사바 근처에 내 간당 가서 뭐지 사바지 사바지 제가 더 미세게 야 장주 나한테 뭐 주시 사바지 와 나머지
Lam Rim
나한테 뭐 주시 다른 바기도 뭐 주시 사바 당어도 가도 한번 주고 가도 내려서 와 어디서 정말 때 이지 때 예제단을 가서 와 간다 정말 때 사바 문제니 앉아 사바 장에 또 문제니 왜 예제단 와 나네 수행도 지야게 고가 상부지 중앙 상무게 간다 그거 유치와
So in this new year, so we have eaten very nice food during Chinese New Year, and then in this new year, we are as if we are starting a new life. And then since we are starting our first class, then we are as if we are learning a new topics. And then now we are on the topic of emptiness. So everything is new, everything is fresh, and this is we should consider ourselves very fortunate, and then we should be very joyful as well because we are able to improve ourselves in this new year.
어디서 당아도 드리마 지야다 상마기로 와 얘가 그 사진이 봐 니바라 소 장시 메바 때라고 봐다 나요 장시 메바 때라고 얘네들이 강자 주마다고 차지 사진送的와 사진送了당보的嘛学意思嘛是吧장시 메바 때라고 되마 이름만学意思와
So Lamrim text, determining them to not exist inherently. This has 3 points. Determining that the I does not inherently exist. Determining that mind does not inherently exist. And showing how persons appear like illusions in dependence on that.
당아서 니시들이 만다르와 당보들라 안다 그거 나랑 심이가 때라고 받으라 간다디 니시기도 쉬고래 나랑 심이가 나랑 심이가 또 봐라 다 간다 니신 상이고래 다 보고 그래서 된다들 좋아 다 나랑 심이가 또 봐라 니신 상다 니시데 맞아 가자 니스니 그거 가자 니스니를 더 못해 님바데 저방이 니스 좋아 저방이 니 또 somebody 님이 찌저도 니 시바도 님이 찌저도 니 니스 다 니시고 다 디카도 맞아 그래서 저바 니시는 좋아
So if you remember, in the last class last year, then we talk about the 4 essential points. So here we are going to realize realize that the I does not exist inherently by way of the 4 essential points. So these 4 essential points we mentioned it in the last class last year. So what are these 4 essential points? The 4 essential points are, the first one is points of ascertaining the object of negation, points of ascertaining the object of negation, and the second one is points of ascertaining the pervasion. Third one is points of ascertaining the absence of truly existent one. And the fourth one is points of ascertaining the absence of truly existent many. So the first one is about the object of negation. The second one is about pervasion. Third one is the absence of truly existent one. And the fourth one is absence of truly existent many.
我这边我都东把那个多了，在是不是给全部是来抢的是。
So in order to realize the profound emptiness, especially for beginners, is very good and it's very important to meditate or to realize the emptiness by means of the four essential points.
讲到这个都我让心里我都倒霉的了，这个倒霉的，去倒霉是逆行有啊，逆修的，我昨天就不讲那个，就等到下午的，当不我让心里把的，我这两辈子就我也是我，这第一接受，要去倒霉，我把他们事情，他讲的我让心，讲出倒霉，我让心里把多把人呐，要去倒霉，多把了，他讲的连他我的也是讲的，对，就是结果是他上头当不。So,
So when we talk about emptiness or selflessness, it can be divided into two: the selflessness of person, and the second one is selflessness of phenomena. So if we were to put it into practice, first we have to cultivate the selflessness of person, followed by cultivations of selflessness of phenomena. So if we first realize the selflessness of person, then it becomes easy for us to realize the selflessness of phenomena because we don't have to think of the reasonings as much.
我讲的是他给全部的，是吧？他讲的，他说的你洗脑了，他当不得，好像你是你也是话，你瞧不得，这给继续的，这可是因为这张经过啥的话题了，是吧？听人多啥的，看到上级了到的，到东西呢也是把他背下来可能不是的，他讲是听到多的，好像你是你也是话的，他讲的上级的，俺这联系这个，进入到了接不接，也是我他看的。让这些被俺这那些这个干的事情都，这个被万一把起来被，一把干的大的都，真正好可能我是我结果也是我的的，我们大家也是也是。
So determining that the I does not inherently exist, the first of four essential points with regard to this is to examine one's own mind stream so as to identify the manner of branding self of persons. So this is the first point. So in other words, is the points of ascertaining the object of negation. So regarding this point, we have already mentioned it in the past. So basically, this first point, points of ascertaining the object of negations, is to how the innate self-grasping apprehends in one's own mind stream. So we are identifying the modes of apprehension of the innate self-grasping in our mind stream. So this innate self-grasping apprehends what is or vice versa. So then we have to identify the modes of apprehensions of the innate self-grasping.
他讲的俺这，那个到底知道俺说，好像你是你的，可是怎么多少的话，人多少的话，他讲的对了，两个这些的是前提讲的，俺说好像你是嘛是吧的，他东半的条件不完了，当不好像你。是吧？全部搞下你也不是，你把什么把也不是你什么的呢？也是说的，他东把你，他开门把东把偏就我东部比偏啥的，你也不知道的，我这了，我把业务偏等我领导的业务偏松了。我
Ken, we can't hear you. Dr. Go says they will switch off and restart. So, Joe, do we log out?
You don't need to log out.
Oh,
Just
okay.
stay where you are.
Oh, okay.
In the Rava. You have to. No. Sorry. Yeah, so Kishla di tanda ni di disconnect. Kisha yellow li di disconnect che any kongi kawa de bijuta. So konda yelo. Yeah, this one is connected to my computer.
Can you hear? Can you hear me?
You cannot turn on. You have to use your yes, yes.
Hear me through the zebra?
Yeah.
Pipin
is
can hear you. Okay, you go like this. Yeah, I'll use my cell phone to image. We use zebra as voice. Okay.
You can see Kishla.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And so yeah, so we tried. When we started the router, so not sure whether it will be okay or not. So only my computer, only my computer, yeah, only my computer is connecting to the router, so should be okay somehow. Is it China? Oh yeah, they should be English. There's some time by yeah. So just like the example, if we want to shoot an arrow and hit the target, then we must see the target properly with our eyes. When you see the target clearly, then you shoot an arrow, then it will hit the target. So if you do not see the target, if you don't even know where the target is, then if you do not see clearly, then there is no way that you can shoot an arrow and hit the target. So similarly, if you want to realize the meaning of emptiness, first, we must identify the object of negation, then followed by the second, third, and fourth essential points. So we have to do it in this gradual order. If not, then since this innate self-grasping is in our mind stream and it naturally arises or it naturally manifests in our mind stream, then it's very, if we want to remove or eliminate this self-grasping, then we must first identify the object of negations properly.
他搞些年是没年的，其他开始挺多的，这样在街上呀，这样这样的就不是吧？他搞些年是个东西的，他写吧，也的，啊，你把这个说，吃饱你的年是吧？这里，啊，吃饱你的年是吧？最简单的，啊，简单，俺这人是对了，那我哪些是吧？啊，人这个弄个是吧？人这个这个，但那我哪些要不然呢？不记得他的工作要还是吧？记得的工作要还是。他记得他的，他看到，是吧？一些通过的记得他的考虑有回来，通过的记得他的有新鲜的通过的记得他的考虑有回来些，我的是吧？
So that was the first point, points of ascertaining the object of negation. So regarding the first point, we will revisit this first point again and again in the future. So now we come, now we go to the second point, the points of ascertaining the pervasion. So if the self or I exists intrinsically or inherently as apprehended by the self-grasping, so if that inherently existent self exists, then it has only two possibilities. If it exists, then it must exist as one with the aggregates, or it must exist as different from the aggregates. So these are the two possibilities that if the self or I exists, the one apprehended by the self-grasping, if it exists, then it must exist as one with the aggregates, or it must exist as different from the aggregates. So it must either of these two if it exists.
我的是说，他讲的吃饱你你也是吧的，他说，是当你那吃饱你记得那得让你去做呢，要记得我的记得他的工作，吃不的也是他的东西多嘛，原来的那个东西吧，原来的东西是吧？吃饱你吃不是吧？吃饱面包是吧？对对吧？啊，马上得看到让你去，本身把让先去的让你主要呢，看到大的，我的。记得他的工作，也不不认识，也不中不认识。也你呢，记得他的工作的点了先，他先他们把他接把这个问题说的，也你呢先就他那个他去没意思，他这个问题他接把的是吧？他接把我是那多啊，这东西，我在这说的，反正有新鲜了，反正得让你去通过的，让你去做呢，通过的记得他的工作，都吃不的，我记得他的。हम देने ले शेबा पूरी थपची योर से ना सावन यो माने नेवा थाचे बा इस तरह के जेरो बिटी पे दो दिन करते हैं ये ना सेम शुरू ना होते
the host was yeah wait
See them then.
yeah. So the text says, so the second is the decision that if the person is inherently established, it must be established as either the same or different in nature from the aggregates, and that there is no means of establishment other than these two. So what it means is, if the self or I, as apprehended by the self-grasping, exists, then it must exist either as one with the aggregates, or it must exist different from the aggregates. So that is the second point of ascertaining the pervasion. So means that it is pervasive in this way. So if it exists, then it must be either as same or one with the aggregates, or it must be different from the aggregates. So it is pervasive in this way. So Jirenmuchi say in the Lamrim, saying that the second point is the decisions or to decide if the person is inherently established, then it must establish as either one or the same or different from the aggregates. And there is no means of establishment other than these two.
所有的操结吧，那都懂多久的是吧？平常是现在你把结果的，咱讲的就是我的，让他的让一起做呢，通过的记得他的，不是也是我在讲的， 소용 내가 두고 그랬어. 와, 두고 그랬어. 뭐 대리를 해봐지 나가면 그러니까 뭐 돈보다 이거 다들 감 이미 해봐지 뭐 열에서는 내가 다 채웠어. 와, 다 채웠어. 근데 돈보다 아니들 아니들 누나 누나들 아니들 누나이나 뭐라 이제 내가 또 디마도 또 데려다. 이니방에 여도 몇도 데려다. 막 너도 하고 뭐지.
So the second point, the point of ascertaining the pervasion, basically is summarized by Jeremiah in this text, saying that the second is the decision that if the person is inherently established, it must be established as either the same or different in nature from the aggregates, and that there is no means of establishment other than these two. So this is the summary given by this is summarized by Jeremiah on the second point. So basically, if the person, if the I or the self or the person exists as apprehended by the self-grasping, then it must exist. So it must or it definitely exists either as one with the aggregates or different from the aggregates. And there's no other way that it can. There's no other way that it can exist. So basically, here it also determined that there is no third way for the I to exist. So as it says here, that there is no means of establishment other than these two.
我的介绍啊，都给강사람이介绍是叫你강사람이那我的记得的搞你我这介绍嘛都去下午是吧？介绍我说介绍的강사람이就呢，通过的记得他的강사读过来，你介绍的嘛这这道去我写完呢，这个钱的写完呢，有新鲜了，有把人新鲜了，这他的港路嘛，应该早年要不的，这个钱的写个当然是吧？这个钱的写呢，有新鲜了。记得他的港路嘛，一般就摇吧就摇的时候，早晚的摇嘛还是，早晚的摇嘛，但我是九八现在摇嘛了。
So this, if person or the I or the self as apprehended by the self-grasping exists, then it must exist either as one with the aggregates or as different from the aggregates. So there is pervasive in this way, or it must exist in this way. There's no third possibility for it, or no third means for it to exist. So this is a very particular scenario. So if we go to the very general scenario, so if anything exists, then it must be either as one or it must be either as different. So even in the general scenario, if anything exists, then it must exist as one or it must exist as different. And there is nothing that could exist in neither way. So then this is something that we can examine or investigate by ourselves.
这小玩意儿，俺说，你嘛的话，你嘛的话，你的话，你嘛的，你嘛的，咱们你嘛的，要不然是要不然老古吧，要不然老古了，你嘛有的话，你嘛的有了，那开是这些这玩意儿，你嘛的记录啊，哦，那记得他在搞弄玩意有不就有嘛了，你嘛的有的有是的，记得他在搞的是呢，记得是老古了，记得老古了，你嘛了。
So, for example, the sun. So, is the sun exist? Then we will say yes, the sun exists. So, if it exists, then does it exist as one or does it exist as different? Then we will say that the sun exists as one, right? And we will not say that the sun exists as different or multiple, right?
哎，你妈的到你了哇！你妈的到你要的还是要老过来啊？你妈的到你要啥？是吧？我是那这啥子？你妈的到你他的了哇？你妈的哇？你妈的你了哇？你妈的到你记得他的干出来是呢？对的，他的你们就是看呢，说说话吧，说去，说话吧是。我第说的，他的老过来，我的对，电脑写的。
So again, if I ask, are the sun and the moon exist? Then we will say yes, the sun and the moon exist. then do they exist as one or do they exist as different? Then the answer is they exist as different. Why? Because the sun and the moon, they are distinct phenomena or they are different phenomena.
또 생각을 하자 그래서 니마 나와세요. 아니 니마 나와니데 니마 나와니 보다 지르다 아들에서 나와이나 다 보고다 다디 차려 봐. 보다 지 말아. 여신제라 한다. 보다 지르다 그런 이거나. 이 제전에 여신제라 지다데 그런 이거서 나서와. 대마 생각도 제라 보고라 쓰잖아. 여신제라 야 보고다 지. 보고다 다디. 내 예보 뭐 타고 니마다 다와 니가 라나디 그래 니마 다와 찔러나디 그래 뭐다 다데가 이래서 뭐다 다데라고 뭐다 다데였어 어디라고 니마 뭐다 다데 니마다 다와니 뭐다 다데였어 뭐다 찌르면서 말했어 나오라 뭐다 찌 말아 다데 찌 차네 이어신지라 찌터데 거는 그거 마치 제가 풍부를 가서 제가 까부지 가서다 나도 풍부를 잘 쉬고와 풍부다 다데래다 찌르해서 나는 풍부다 그래서 니마다 다와니 풍부다 다데가 찌 그래서
So in general, if anything exists, then it must exist as one or it must exist as different. So there are no other means, but there is no third possibility for it to exist. So then this is in a general scenario. So if we were to link it to a particular scenario, so in this case where we are talking about the I and the aggregates, right? I and the aggregates. So then using the same example that I mentioned just now, the sun and also the moon. So do the sun and the moon exist as one or different from the aggregates? So first, does the sun and the moon, and as well as aggregates exist? Then the answer, yes, they exist. Then if I ask another questions, do the sun and the moon exist as one with the aggregates or exist as different from the aggregates? Then the answer is the sun and the moon do not exist as one with the aggregates because they are different phenomena. They exist as different from the aggregates. So you can say that the combinations of the sun and the moon, whether they exist as one with the aggregates, then the answer is exist as one with the aggregates. The answer is no, because they exist as different from the aggregates. So similarly, if you take the sun out and then leave the moon, so if does the moon exist as one with the aggregates, then the answer is still no. It doesn't exist as one with the aggregates, and because they exist as different from the aggregates. So you link the general example that I mentioned just now to this particular context, which is the aggregates there we are talking right now. So you can also assimilate in this way.
다 디저와 다 관다 가서 예 니바디 예 와치가 누리니서 일단은 매일 그래서 뭔가 가와서 배장 쉬고도 뭔가 가와서 지단 쉬고도 같이 담에서 쉬고도 다만도 뭔가 가와 아저 다지 저 이모스 제바나 담이 판단 바 제바레서 다 가서 다지 세워데 반가들이 다지다 담에서 다지데 근데
주말로.
뭐 다지도 도마 다지도 도마 아미스는 지 좋아 지라 거야지 지라 거야지 어떻게 거야지 뭐다 거니 많이 봐 차고디 지인 봐 많이 봐 지인 봐도 파까 나 많이 봐 타치는 거야 뭐다 거니 많이 봐지 뭔가 서고 왜 니지 거 봐. 뭐다 거니가 더 많이 봐 다디니 봐 지시오디 뭐다 거니 지 조금 좀 말해서 봐 알아 난지라 봐 이거 좀 이해하는 그와 용지의 노이 중이야 이게 난지라 가서 가셔야 가셔야 부셔 되지 싶대 그와 뭐다 거니 부셔 진 뭐다 거니 수 하고 니와 하고 아니는 뭐다 거니有嘛吧搞가셔 난지 용지스나 가셔야 부셔 된다 도도 그래 좋아 이게 그 두자 오바다 까와니 사하 고지 오바다 까와니 나제 나 이마다 바카사 레스 저니 마레스 오게 나 디시고와
Yeah, so in the text says, the text says, in general, it is established through experience that when you determine something to be plural, thinking something like pot and pillar, you eliminate that it is singular. And when you determine something to be singular, thinking something like pot, you eliminate that it is plural. So singular and plural, singular basically refers to one, and then plural refers to many or different. So the example, pot and the pillar. So pot and pillar, they are different. Pot and pillar, they are different or they are many. So when you determine that pot and pillar as different or many, then this is the object you prove. The object to establish, the object to establish that pot and pillar are different or they are different or many. So when you determine that pot and pillar are different or many, then you already eliminate another point. Another point is that they are one, pot and pillar being one. So by determining that pot and pillar as different or many, you eliminate that they are being one. So basically, you establish something and you negate something. So you establish that they are being different. At the same time, you negate that they are being one.
다 대가 넣으시 뭔가 다만 다음에 수용 수제반나 다 다지 원나마 지바 동이 주로 그래 다 길이 된다 고자는 빛이 나보러 와
본다.
와 이때 와다 부반이 와다 까와니 샤이와 와다 까와니 다 빛이 용서 누구니 아동한 지다 지로와 미 그렇지 다다 부바데 지보데 부바 지보데 다음에 막스 용서 그래서 누구니 다지 니마다 바까 와 부바데 와 다지 인바 바까지 그까봐서你出路와 그 부바데 다음에 부바데 찌인 바서 거기 생겨버리 부바데 니 말이 많이 받아 유지 바까로 와 다데 너 원래 가는 거야 와 부바 찌인 바 니어디 부바 니 바다 가는 거야 오 어디 부바 찌 이게 부바 니 있으니까 그 중반이나 이거 좀 이렇게 바로 부바데 찌인지 니 있으니까 좀 이거 여 바로 다 부바데 와 부바지 동으로 다시
부바지나
다시 부바지 동으로 다시 부바지 수동으로 다시 부바니 바로 파 다들와 어디
So similarly, if you look at a pot, there is only a pot there, then you look at that pot. So when you see that pot, then you establish that this pot is one. So when you establish or when you understand that this pot is one, then at the same time, you eliminate this pot being many. So there's only one pot there. Then when you see one pot there, then you know that there's only one pot. And when you establish that that pot it's one, so at the same time it eliminates that pot or eliminates that pot from being many.
이제 손들을 나가다 원래 이미 지시잖아요. 찌다 더 강에 많이 분수 매라는 거서 분수 세워야 돼. 이거 분수 세워야 돼. 이 신체라 찌 많이 더 많이 찌 여봐이나 다 분수 거지 여서. 분수 거지. 분수지 여서나 들지 오거다. 분수 여봐이나 이 신체라 찌다 다들 그 많이 찌 여봐이나 분수 받다 돼. 그 들지 분수 거지 여래요. 여마다 어떠시 잘 너무 말해요. 예, 근데 또 강에 많이 분수 내라세. 또 말했어요. 좋아. 분수 받지 연아 안디가 그 좋아. 일단 분수 세워서 가서 까또 같이 해서 잡고 와. 제가 신담으로 와. 내가 등가서 지대 도만 잡으러 와. 어쩌면 다 지가 여 신지라 지가 또 강에 많이 분수 시켜서 또 저 말해. 우리 여봐이나 분수 시켰다. 이거 말했어.
네가 많이 말아. So a third alternative, something that is neither one nor many, does therefore not exist. So as I say, if something exists or if anything exists, it must be either exist as one or as different. So if anything could exist could exist as neither one nor many, then it becomes the third possibility or third alternative. However, this third alternative does not exist. There is no such third alternative or possibility.
다들 원래 된다도 맞듯이 비교하고다 간다. 간사대 간다 아니지 두나. 대신 뭐 지다. 거기 이 미국 스파는 맛이 봐 샤워서 그렇게 저런 거지 다 제서더와. 다 제자네. 간다. 이제 뭐 지다 다들이 뭐야 미봐야 스파는 맛이 제가 어디서 저런 거 손사네. 와. 가르스나 간사대 아니지 두나. 그보다 뭐 지다 다들 뭐야 미봐 스파. yes 스파는 맛이 제가 이게 봐 샤워서 너도 제가 어제 어디 간다 가자를 안 주나 뭐다 뭐지다 다리니 뭐야 많이 봐지 무슨 말이야 진짜 샤치를 소리다 그래서 하고 생각 쉬우지 봐
가사를 시기 도나 이제 부부가 오지 양나타데 가양 마인바 괜히 마인바 마인바
무슨 말이야 무슨 말이야 무슨 말이야 무슨 간다 무슨
So consequently, you are made to ascertain that to be neither one nature nor different natures is also impossible. So the text says that consequently, you are made to ascertain that to be neither one nature nor different natures is also impossible. So meaning that if person or I or self inherently exist, then it must exist either as inherently either as one with the aggregates or different entities from the aggregates. And he said, and the Jeremiah ascertained that or determined here that there is no possibility that inherent existent person could exist neither one nature nor different natures from the aggregates. So as it says here, to be neither one nature nor different natures is also impossible. So it's also impossible also means that it is not possible among the objects of knowledge.
뭐또 저번에 민니에서 다른 거 사비게 되다와 저번에 민니에서 또 사비게 또 개치시로 막 와서 숨바의 시간이 숨바의 시간이 다 찍고 쉬고 다들 쉬고 자는 거 가서 가정에 신차이제라 안다 저번에 민니에서 어디 간다 나가 가서 숨바의 시간이 가라 디는 뭐 내가 디는 레고 와 디는 레고 요래 한번 가정에 있으면 딱 간다 디는 거 다 숨바들이 개치고 쉬고 지내야 돼. 다 간다. 간다데 맞아. 데비치다는 게 민니에서 데리다.
So the third is to see the damage to the position that the person and the aggregates are one inherently established nature. So one inherently established nature, another way of saying this is inherently one, or exists as inherently one. So when we go through these four essential points, first we identify the object of negation, and followed by ascertaining the probation, then it will follow. Then it follows the third and the fourth point, where we need to do lots of analysis. So the third point is to ascertain the absence of truly existent one. So that's why it says the third is to see the damage to the position, where the person and the aggregates are one inherently established nature. And the fourth is to see well the damage to the position that the two are established as inherently different. So this one inherently established nature in the third point, and the two are established as inherently different. So these are the probations that we previously ascertain in the second point. So if it exists, then it must exist as one or different, right? So then we come to the third and the fourth point. Then we ascertain that I'll say it is absence of such existence. In other words, saying this is to see the damage to the position that the person and the aggregates are one inherently established nature. And the fourth is to see well the damage to the position that the two are established as inherently different. So these are the four essential points. So when the four essential points are complete in that manner, this produces the pure view, realizing the suchness that is the selflessness of persons. So if we understand these four essential points well, then definitely one will develop the pure view, realizing the emptiness.
다들 가나마가서 그렇잖아. 무슨 시간이면 이제 개발시고 이 개발시고 개발시는 너무 가서 예 숨바다 시간이 너무 네 숨바 이미 기다리는 게 서드만 쉬어요. 이미 기다리는 게 있어요.
So then from here, then it talks about then it is the extensive explanations of the third and fourth point. So then the first is going to talk about the third point, which is points of ascertaining the absence of truly existent one.
다른다 dembi 기다서 와서 아프니 장기 주지 뭐 지다가 뭐지 많이 봤다 가다 두고와 나쁘니와 다다 부분이 장기 주지 뭐지다 다와서 다 된다 된다 지다 다와서 하시로와 다다 부분이 장기 주지 뭐지다 다와 뭐지 말해서 다 지다 제와서나 뭐지 말해 뭐지 아 그래서 와 뭐지 바까 뭐지 말해서 다 된다 시고와.
So if the self, the text says, in this regard, so if the self and the aggregates had one inherently established nature, so there would be, so if the self and the aggregate had one inherently established nature, so means that, so what we have to ascertain is the self and the aggregates are absence of truly existent one. So here it talks about if the self and the aggregates had one inherently established nature, right? And in relation to the third point, then we need to ascertain the absence of truly existent one, right? So in other way of saying this is, the self, we need, at this point, in relation to the third point, we need to ascertain that the self and the aggregates the aggregates are absent in being truly existent one. So they are not truly existent one. They are not inherently one. So we need to negate them from being inherently one.
디카도 참을 싶어요. 비로시스가 또 제는 진짜래. 다리에 나도 나리노 또 가샤 요도 메도 갈리는 거다. 나도 배 한번 짓다 와대. 요도 메도 갈리는 거 근데 그래서 참하게 나도 돼. 람리 같은 벤진가 가시 지요래. 근데 참하게 제 이거 슈지네 마치 바지 내 전부 지다 자도 있어. 내가 내가 이디지가 내려오라.
Yeah, so previously we also talked about these four essential points, and then at this particular point, we talk about it is mainly on the view of emptiness, and then in relation to these important points, then we are at the very important context or pages that talks about the object of negations. So I encourage all of you to focus well, and then to put effort in understanding this.
오, 되시. 다른 것은 이해 송바들다. 다른 이해 송바들 간다. 들어와. 디비치다 등에 비니에서 와디리. 디비치다서 와다. 다분히 장이 그 뭐지다 배워서 들어와. 다분히 장이 그 뭐지 이수나. 근데 진수다. 그 선지장. 그 선지장 다 비다 빨리다 나오라. 근데 진수 당말. 진수 와. 선지장 진수. 당부 진수도 뭐 당부 진수 도도 지나면 되지. 진수도 가르에서나 다 캐나봐. 되네봐. 캐나 뭐지? 다 캐나봐. 되네봐. 다분히 장이 주비 뭐지 이수나. 다분히 장이 주비 뭐지나. 다 캐나봐. 되네봐. 진지다. 와, 다 마본지 진지 진이래서 다 somebody 진지 제도 좋았어. 다 진지 제도 좋아. 진지. 그 손이 와. 다 진수가 만드시지 봐. 제대로 좋아. 그 진수는 내가 지 와, 이 중에서도 그다 상지장 중요래. 그다 사실인 게 바로 와. 나 자와케를 그거는 사실인 게 봐. 이다 빨리다 상지장이 되나고 나就是와. 이 중에서도 다 다분히 장이지 주변 뭐 지인바이나 다 캐나면 돼요. 그러면 이제 지에 대해서 니바데 다 마본지 제자. yes. somebody 다 진지지도 저도 그래서 이 중에 대해서 그 중에서도 막 it's much more. Let's use the word decision.
That's all. So basically, the third point is the points of ascertaining the absence of truly existent one. So what it means is we need to ascertain the self and the aggregates are absence of being truly existent one. So if the self and the aggregates had one inherently established nature, in other words, is if the self and the aggregates were inherently one, there would be three faults to refute these positions. And the three faults are, first, it would be pointless to assert a self. And the second one is, it follows that the self would be many. And the third one is, the self would arise and the self would arise as and disintegrate. So these are the three faults mentioned in the Buddha Palita, the commentary on the root text on wisdom composed by Nagarjuna. So these are the three faults. It would be pointless to assert the self will become many, and the self would arise as disintegrate.
Oh, that the Jews don't put Jews on the teacher. That Jew don't put in our that Jews no Jew don't put it. That kill number. Then the Bobo the Jews are the Hakobuta. That one is on you to be more gene as a telepath. She's over that. He Hakoba Jibdama, she said that Jew Consa, she said that. How many Rani to be more genius na? A Jew and you. How many Rani to be more genius na? And that Jew fan, not go to James. 아니 주변 뭐 진스나 다분히 지차는 거 있어 왔다 간다. 내가 너도 좀 인사들이 좋아. 아니 주변 뭐 진의 지차는 거. 근데 지차우리 뭐 다 캐나데 몇몇바 차도 다 써도 캐나마 몇몇바 차도 무슨 어디지 와. 이마 양자만 드시죠. 와.
So regarding the first fault, that it would be pointless to assert the self. So the base of the base of criticism is if the self and the aggregates were inherently one. So this is the base where the arguments come. So in other way of saying the self and the aggregates were inherently one is if they were inherently one, the self and the aggregates will become one. So that is when that is the point where many faults will follow. So then the first fault will follow is it will be pointless to assert a self.
다 전에 뭐 차도 자동 가리세요. 다분히 뭐 있으나 뭐 집이든 라니 주나 이와 때문에 이게 참 된다 되려고 다 왔을 때 되는 뭐 치도 뭐 내버려. 이와 때문에 지래. 이와 때문에 지도 차나 진짜 와. 그 때문에 지도 차는 거랬어. 와. 이와 때문에 지도 주나 뭐 이거 된다도 주고는 이리로 가라나야. 된다 너도 그래. 이와 때문에 지도 찼어. 이와 때문에 지도 찼으나 다 세워지 생각 봐서 공부해서 어떻게 미지 다 세워서 취지 공부해서 시와 근데 이게 다 세워 키랑 바지 무슨 그런 거 없이 다 세는 맞으나 공부가 미기 난다 잘해도 알아도 알았어 와 공부지 이와 때문에 공부를 안 하셨어 공부가 미기 난다랑 하셨어 그러니 미기 난다 잡은 지가 되셨어 어디로 걸 아까 주인한테 들다 다서와 켈라와 연락이 문도 문다 뭐 미나라 살아 해도 하지
So the first fault is it will be pointless to assert a self because if the oneness of nature of the two were inherently established, in other words, is if the self and the aggregates were inherently one, they would be a completely indivisible one. So the fault is that the reason is they will become a completely indivisible one or completely inseparable one, or they become inseparably one. So if if the aggregates and the self or I or person were inherently one, then they would become in completely inseparable or indivisible one. So if the self and the aggregates were inseparable one, they would become one. So if they become one, then there is no point it will be pointless to assert a self. So in fact, the aggregate is the basis of imputations upon which the convention or the term self is imputed, right? So that self is the imputed phenomena. So however, if you were to assert the self and the aggregates as inherently one, then they will become inseparable one. If they become inseparable one, they become one. So they will become one. So if they become one, then it will be pointless to assert the self, because self is aggregate. They become one already, then the self is the aggregate. The self is the aggregate itself. The self would be just the equivalent term of aggregate. So other than being the equivalent term of the aggregates, they are basically one. So this reason, the faults would follow if they were inherently one, then they become inseparable one. Since they are inseparable one, then they become one. And since they become one, then there's no point to assert the self, because the self would be just an equivalent term of the aggregates, or just a synonym of the aggregates.
我这，那看到这个的，要不让你准备，我仅仅是呢，那这种就是说强，我这，那看了吧，电视吧，恰当的还不多啊，因为恰当的那通过的让你准备，我其实呢，那时候的看了吧，电视看了或者，因为电视吧，反正电视吧看了是呢，大部分让你注册了以后，对面记得查了我的，以后对面记得查查的，俺的，那是呢。 不过是呢，每个南大长期嘛都啊，基本上的基本上人下是基本上人下是，被下边呢，那也没了，那个溶解是个大问题，那我是大了，我溶解的大呢，但是每个南大长期嘛，地方系列下是，是吧？溶解啊，是吧呢？那也每个南大上也是，那也每个南大上，那反正溶解是呢，大我是呢，那也没啥，这个基本上是，基本上是。 这个东西差不多是的，那是要骗人吧？这个人来干什么？啊，在中国是呢，你要对面记得掐着的，记得啊，是吧？你强调是的，根据卷的内容有什么？我干的话，对。
So here it basically talks about if the self and the aggregates were inherently one, then it would be pointless to assert the self. So because if the self and the aggregates were inherently one, then they would become a completely indivisible one. So if they become a completely inseparable one, so this self would be just is just a equivalent term of the aggregate to become one already. So basically, the self is the aggregate itself. So if the self were the aggregate itself, then the self would be just equivalent term, would be just an equivalent term of the aggregate. Then just like the example, the rabbit bearer. So rabbit bearer is the equivalent term of the moon. So basically, if you say rabbit bearer, then basically it refers to the moon itself. So if the self and the aggregates were inherently one, then the self would become the equivalent term of the aggregates, just like the example of moon and the rabbit bearer.
我的是说，那看到溶解了溶解了大瓦些，我看到每个地方都在出入我是背对去的话，我对嘛这看到大部分的那让你我记得住呢，因为大部分的老人这个那不定穿的那以后嘛是，这个那以后嘛的记得我那以后嘛的，大部分让你记得住在那，我记下来，大部分都本地的那什么，他这个那也是要没事，是吧？我的那以后嘛的。 那我那是记得了嘛都，我记嘛都，那我的那个那是一个地方的，没错，大部分人一住在的话是，这个就是我说，
Then he continues to say in the text that this is because if their sameness of nature were ultimately established, so in other words is if the aggregates and the self were inherently one, then whatever mind those two appeared to, they would necessarily not appear distinct. So meaning that if the self and the aggregates were inherently one, then whatever mind that it appears to, it will appear as one. It will not appear as different. So the modes of appearance and the modes of abiding are concordant in that they are one. So it will not appear as distinct. It will not appear as different. Why? Because they are inherently one. So if they were inherently one, then whatever mind those two refers to the aggregates and the self. So whatever mind those two appear to, then they would necessarily not appear distinct. So they would necessarily appear as one.
他这个嘛背下我了就对绝对是背的嘛叫的，金宝工作把拿出的那种地方，我们讲是，那我说金宝上拿出背，手动就背下来哇，手的，他手的背，那工作把它闹的，那那是原来嘛，明白了吧？那我拿去手手对吧？工作把那我拿去，那我就背手上问题拿着，哎，这个好的，那我拿去原来我读嘛的时候啊，这嘛都被解决的。 Jimba sonza na je ngala tampo yo yes jimba ro na tsime so be ipa chagu mare den ga yo ma na tsime zimi ping mare yes jimba de pa na tsime ma ti ba ina ga wa ke yo ma de na ga yes so wa bu ni ani ji de na ji cha ta ni o se ni tsime ko re da to da ni na tsime so ko yes no ko wa o de ni che ba shi Member to Bola thinking, every year, Second, it wasn't all on it. Music, not the nation. The Diva said, we are no, he is a so.
So among falsities or conventions, it is not contradictory for the way they appear and the way they abide to be discordant, but in something truly established, those two are necessarily contradictory, because something truly established that appears to a mind must appear just the way it is. So here, so regarding the falsities of conventions, so when a falsity appears to a conventional mind, such as a form. So when a form appears to a conventional mind, then it appears as inherently existent. So though it appears as inherently existent, it does not exist inherently existent in reality. So therefore, its modes of appearance and the modes of abiding are discordant. But it is like that. There is no contradictory means that for falsities, then it is like that. For its modes of appearance and the modes of abiding to be discordant. So, however, for something truly established, another way of saying this is for something to be inherently existent, like the case that we are investigating right now, the self and the aggregates. So, if the self and the aggregates were inherently one, then its modes of appearance and its modes of abiding must be concordant. If it is not concordant, if it is not concordant, then it would be contradictory.
Oh, the Vajua. I can't DJ. I can't yet and that one to Bakilama. Good knowledge about that, and that different developer. What the Pashi and that one to see Kilama and the Pugo knowledge as she to be turned on it. And they turned to Dubaina, not for what a chill to study. Like your maris, your Morushida, good knowledge, like your maris one. It do Mari. The Pugo the chill to Tuzana, the knowledge about where the home maris. What did you like your years ago? This year, what I'm going to do, the watch out of what they shall you continue to have your maris.
切波波你切波波当风波跌落啊，怕跌落。
我他对吧？
So, and the text says, a self established by its intrinsic nature is asserted to establish an agent who discards and adopts aggregates. So here refers to the opponent's assertions. So it's asserted by the opponent. So they say, a self established by its intrinsic nature. So another way of saying this is, if a self exists intrinsically. So a self exists intrinsically. So this is asserted to establish an agent who discards and adopts aggregates. So because if we were one with the aggregates, this would be impossible. Then in our own system, to refute this point, then it says that if he or the self were one with the aggregates, then this would be impossible. So the opponent says that they assert the self exists intrinsically so that they can establish the agent who discards and adopts aggregates. So, however, in our own system, it says that if the self exists intrinsically, then it will become, if he were intrinsically one with the aggregates, then this would be impossible. So then the agent, the agent would become the agent and the aggregates, they are different, but they are not inherently different. So if we were inherently one with the aggregates, then it would be impossible to discard and adopt the aggregates.
我就是说，我对我的梦是早些的用去当为说，他另外的帮忙都对导演帮忙，因此他刚才听到的人是吧？那个另外那边通过了嘛，对不嘛多吧？因为没有钱，另外那边拿去，对了嘛都通过的了嘛，对吧？当然，另外的这个拿去，没算是比较麻的是吧？
通过了吗？对吧？
通过了嘛，对吧？哇，通过的了嘛，对吧？因为没有钱，另外那包括。有的是呢，要买的时候，要买的时候，你往联邦，你往联邦马多比那，罗有买一些，
Yes. So this is also set forth in the root text on wisdom. So once you agree that apart from the aggregates that you incorporate, there is no self. So means that there is no self. There is no self that does not depends on the aggregates. There is no self. Here it says that apart from the aggregates that you appropriate, then there is no self. So means that there is no self that doesn't depends on the aggregates. The self, in fact, depends on the aggregates. So apart from the aggregates, then there is no self. So there is no self, the appropriator of the aggregates, apart from the aggregates, then there is no self, the appropriator of the aggregates.
这就是知道我说你往那边，我是不知你往那边我是，但我是这些的酒的，你往联邦是你往联邦是，
你往联邦，
你往联邦是你往不过的，你往联邦是你往的不过的，你那属于通过的啦，那你往那边不是的，你往那属于我的啦，你往那边不是的，都是习惯。
你往联邦那顶有梦了呗？
我的，我联邦是我的，你那属于通过因素的，往那边不是。我因为这里属于通过说的，你往那个我了，我的这些了我就是说这些东西。
呀，这里中为公布营上那顶你往那边公布了。
我是我的。
So if we were to explain the words appropriate or appropriated in this context, so the etymological explanations of this word appropriate would be so appropriate in terms of etymology, then it means afflictions. So appropriate also means afflictions. So the aggregate that arises from that is the appropriated aggregates. So to explain this etymologically, appropriate or appropriations refers to afflictions. So the aggregates that arise from that, since aggregate arise from that, it becomes the appropriated aggregate.
다 간다데 사실 그 담보데 간다 된다데로와 다 간다 요월렘발라 몰라 마토바데 다지 가다 요리 신비 다지 요리 좀 요마레스 된다데 다 원래 지금 뭐만 다 잡아놔 그냥 잡아놔 요월렘비 다 이거 취지 다는 내가 인수하되 그런 kelangdala ba tsobana wa ba niwani ni da yin lo so de wa niwani da yin chi chi da ne ba yin se wa de ba pora de kelangde anda pora de da ba de niwani be pungo de ni niwani ba be da do de ran ji ji yo re se be ni ji ge shi niwani be pungo de ni niwani ba be da da yo re se ni ji yo re se
영화 레벨 공부 당다 내가 신기 거래
niwani 어디 요리 부모들이 저거 대박 됐다도 요바리 에세 나한테 미지게 싫어 그러나 그래라 나한테 요 말다 치리다는 내가 이제 따뜻하게 또 대지 그 말이 요 말에 미지 요 말이 요리 뭐 어디 다 요리 뭐 됐다도 나지 요 말에 요 말에 저거 루즈들이 요리 뭐 됐다서 어디 너희 집에 요리 뭐 됐다서 요 말에 에세 봐 치리다는 내가 이제 되래 치리다는 내가 이제 근데 요리 뭐 됐다 아니 그거 좀 이거 말해서 되지 요 말해서 다 너도 담았지 되는 거
영화는 직접 DNA 그래서 레인죠
레이다
그래서
요리 비다도 그런 거 같지 치리다는 뭐 이거 많이 되는 레인 이슈가 치리다는 내가 있어 킬리라고 잡고 다 레이 가르스나 다 들리 저런 킬리 말해서 요리 그거에 딱한다 치리 요리 뭐 비다지 좀 지요 봐 다지 좀 지. 근데 여기까지 이제한테 요 말에 그리고 말에 근데 저런 그 루저때 요 레버베다 뭐지 이어스나 근데 요 말에서 그냥 뭐 다음에 봐 차는 거예요. 요 말에서 근데 그만을 얘라고 저거다. 저는 또 말이 디스보다 더 그런 거.
그래서 규기 단위 매바인
치다는 내가 이제
영화 레이 단위노 규기 단위 매바인
치다는 내가 이제 달래라. 다 규지 루라 가는 요 레버베다 써다 뭐 지어서 키랑스나 키랑도 배워 말에 지요 말에서 못 간다. 도도 들
also so and then basically this verse or especially the third and the fourth lines is the answer to the opponents who assert the operator aggregates and the selves exist inherently. So then in this root text on wisdom in this verse and especially the third line and the fourth line is the answer to them. So it's to refute them is the answer to refute their assertions that the self is nothing but the aggregates. In that case, your self doesn't exist.
다들이다. 다는 소배 다 주님바든다 주님바도와 다 주님바도 가르스나 주님바도야 요다 다 마문주 와서 주들와 다 마문주 주 가르스 그러면 주님 시작 기시오다 다분히 랑이 집에 뭐 지나 와서 됐잖아 시작이 들어오다 다분히 랑이 집에 뭐 지나 다 마문주로 다 와. 그 주당 가르스나 다분히 랑이 집에 뭐 지나 이거 이미지 찍는 거래. 내가 또 바꿔 씌우고 와. 이거 데미지 찍는 거래. 이거 데미지 찍으시나 그 지차. 그래서. 좋아. 나분이 이거 데미지 찍으시나 나분이 지차다. 다 지차는 다 좀 몰래 오고 와. 네. 이거.
Yeah, so basically this verse talks about there is no self exists as something other than the aggregates. Yeah, there is no self exists as something other than the aggregates. Another way of saying this is there is no self could exist without depending on the aggregates. So then this is the first fault. And then the second fault is it follows that the self would be many. So this is the second fault. And then we have to remind ourselves that the base of arguments is if the self and the aggregates were inherently one, then they would become inseparable one. If they become inseparable one, they would become one. So they become one. So if they become one, then the second fault will follow, which is the self would be many.
어디시? 다가서 다 마문주 쥐들다. 다 다분이랑 이쪽에 뭐 지으나 다 이와 데미지 지도 두고 그래서 이와 데미지 지도 두나 이와 데미지 지도나 그 간사지라 부분 때문에 여봐나시 大家嘛不记住，不是的，因为对面记住去了，中国的基因啊，我的基因是的，这中国的基因是呢，广播考试呢，刚才这个中国的嘛，数据我做一部理解部的中国的嘛有的话，中国的嘛也是，我的记下那中国的嘛有的，刚才这个那中国是吧？我的嘛有把那些我唱是的，我唱不是的，这个没有问的时候有的话。
So the text says, second, it follows that the self would be many. There would be the fault that if the self were established as one with the aggregates, so meaning if the self and the aggregates were inherently one, then just as one person has many aggregates, so one person would also have many selves. So the base of argument is if the self and the aggregates were inherently one, then they will become inseparable one. If they become inseparable one, then they become one. So since one person has multiple aggregates, such as form, feeling, discrimination, and compositional factors and consciousness, then similarly, a self would become many selves. So this is the fault.
我的讲了说，他刚才打毛本就的，他就是说，打毛本就打的，他碰不到因为对面去打本的让你就我记住个呢，让你吃我记呢，要打本的，因为对面的记得差了过来，因为对面的记得差是呢，记差的幅度，记差的打碰不到，记差的，中国俺要把那些打俺差的幅度不是的话，打俺差的幅度不是的话，打俺差的，第二那些那记嘛对吗？那记的没把那些。我那些记，这样的是中国人的记，是吧？那记嘛要嘛，他是那中国的记家呢，那记嘛那些中国人啊，记，也是那特别准过来，看到是吧？那技巧的，那忙记，你个有的就你写的这种。
So the base of arguments is if the self and the aggregates were inherently one, then they would become inseparable one. If they were inseparable one, they become one. So if they become one, then just like there are five aggregates, a self or a person or the I will become many selves. Okay. But it's also, yeah, no, that's all.
让คนที่เคม
Yeah. Yeah.
你看了我
10 minutes.
是多少的
It
人？
still last long.
자, 제가 쭉 부당 고맙습니다. 송아. Okay, put in the middle. Okay, it's middle. Okay, yeah. Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. So just like one person has many aggregates, then one person would become many selves or would have many selves, and just like there is no more than one self. So since there's only one person or one self, then the five aggregates would only become one aggregate. So these are the faults that would follow if the aggregates and the self were inherently one.
我的是，是吧？那就这个我们有不这个，我就把这大白个在这里头的，大部分让你这，我这是呢，我就把嘞，这我当时买的，但是我就是到买这个的话，那得家庭我这样子，把这大白个，这个我们就。
And then Jerome quoted Chandrakirti's Entering the Middle Way says that aggregates are many. If they were the self, there would then be many selves.
这刚才这个了，那个早些的人，对，我答应呢，计划成绩不去，但是你不是的，是吧？那么是就送吧的话，就送吧，那就送吧的，大部分让你这个，我其实呢，有对，到经济阶段就是也是到阶段的经济阶段。
So this is all about the second. This is the second fault, and the third fault is the self would arise as disintegrate. So if the self and the aggregates were inherently one, the self would arise as disintegrate.
다들 간다 더군이랑 이제는 진실의 가능 중에서 이다 다뭐 중국 다들와 다랑 이주를 걸 제장자 당원다데 들어와 우리랑 이주를 뭐 지선 진실의 저러고 그래서 들어와 중국에 간다 다다랑 이 진이스나 중국 기지라 진리 제발이 어서 오는 거죠. 중국에 가서 기지라 진리 제발이도 다랑 이주를 예 기지라 랑 이주를 기지가시라 지와도 지고 지는 줄 그래서 와 rangi tuwa shigo wa ko de ngazo ki la jino wa ko de ki la jino res ki sheba na shi da rangi tuwa ya da rangi tuwa ski de shigo wa da rangi tuwa de ko da rangi da de ki la wa ro yo ki la wa ro yo tani da de wa ki la wa ro de wa ro de na da rangi tuwa de ki la da isma ki nga shi la jiwa da jipa ji 그 리그마 가서 rangi tuwa kitinga shi chingi shi baina kitinga ma shi ma dewa me ba cha rangi tuwa kitinga ma shi ma dewa chin me pe rangi tuwa de kitinga ma shi ma dewa me ba dewa che de dewa che de da ne ada inji che de dewa se wa de wa kitinga se ma to chen de bu de chen de la che de wa kitinga ba pa ji ya chwa ma de ba sa wa kitinga ba ma de bu ji de bu 내가 차서와 뭐 매일세 내가 거기 지시마서 이렇게 며 매일세 부분 지서와 뭐 지서 공부 로버 나시 다들 로버 뭐 공부 로버 지도 나시 다들 로버 지도 하시 든지 차는 거래 다들 뒤에 우리 예세 거로
So the third fall is the self would arise as disintegrate, and the root text on wisdom by Nagarjuna says, if the aggregates were the self, it would arise as disintegrate. So this is based on the argument, the base of arguments, which is if the selves and the aggregates were inherently one, then just like the aggregates go through momentarily changes, it arises, disintegrates momentarily, then the self would similarly rise as disintegrate. In general, the conventional self does go through changes momentarily. However, in this context, we are talking about the self that exists inherently, the self that exists inherently. So if the self exists inherently, then the previous moment and the later moment of the self will become unrelated. So because the previous moment of the self disintegrates, and then it will not be related to the next moment of the self anymore. So the connections between the previous and the later moment of the self would break. So since the aggregates disintegrates advantageously, then the self would also disintegrate advantageously.
我今晚上那么在系统嘛，从头到尾哇，发这个大会记的我不答应呢，那经济计划的我经济这帮人经济计划的，我经济习惯就是大家经济习惯就是也经济结果就是个是，那大会呢，当你这个计划现在最强的我真的得给不多，因为就是计划都在给他们也是他都得的哇。
So basically, if the self were inherently one with the aggregates, then just like the root text on wisdom says, if the aggregates were the self, it would arise as disintegrate. So just as the aggregates arise as disintegrate, so the self would also arise as disintegrate, because the two would be one.
那对我们嘛，我的学吧学的，大概看上时候的经济人来经济学吧的，有的经济学吧对吧，就是对吧，有的是。 다들 이보다 기시를 보러와 여러 다니다가 일단 대화서 제요 말이나 바로 그 코케는 나다 가리키나다 나사랑 게 세게 두바케나 다랑 게 랑지 두바케나 다 랑지 두바데 기지라 지지 제바데 니바이나 지지 제바이스나 그거다 그러나 이 주사다 많이 주사지라 간다 소수와 주 지와 마데 다 지금 못 벌려서 기지라 기지데 그러면 소나 누가 채나 와 주만 와 나도 기지기지는 다들 다니 다들 기지 我毕竟我军嘛，我蛮独有的，我蛮独有的军嘛，我大的让一直被打死的，你毕竟我毕竟你爸爸我都是乱用，我钱了，你住在那，你不那么对吧？过了，然后你住在哪？我这住在的，他军的话给我没什么，军嘛，给嘛，对呀嘛，等你军嘛的话呢，就要干嘛的，就要什么子的，还是全啥的，这都还是什么了，他把那个话。
And the text says, you may think it is asserted that the self or person arises as disintegrates in each moment. There is no fault in merely asserting this conventionally. So meaning a conventionally existent self or person, they do arises as disintegrates momentarily or in each moment. So there is no fault in merely asserting these conventionally. So because it refers to the conventionally existent self. So, however, an opponent who asserts that persons are established by way of their intrinsic characteristics. In other words, the opponent asserts that person exists intrinsically, inherently. So thereby necessarily asserts that person arise as disintegrate inherently. So if the self exists inherently, then it would arise as disintegrates inherently as well. So if self exists inherently or intrinsically without depending on other, then there is no continuum. So the conventionally existent self, they are in a continuum. They are in a continuum they are in a continuum. So connecting the previous moment to the later moment. So, however, if the self will exist inherently, then this continuum of the previous and later moments would break. So there is no more continuations or no continuum there anymore. And similarly, then it will be impossible to generate the remembering consciousness or memory consciousness. So this will come later.
那对我的去，那到那个说，刚才说
继续写啊。
上去讲的卷送的都是多少了哇？那上去讲的那是哇，这个卷送，那不过的，让人知道我记忆是呢，那上去讲的都是卷送，当我点着，对吧？对我两家卷送要，两家卷送，我两家卷是不是你把人的了？你把人的，他把你到这是吧？我这把你到这边样的卷送出来是吧？他到不呢，让你这边我记是呢，让你这边我记是呢，啊，卷送我的卷送可是呢，就要这么没比。아무 들어와 지와팀만 우리 비행기다 다 레시바 출대는 이와지 계지 레시바 출대는
功德第唐波底
이거 이거 정말 좋아
嗯
정말 모두 지와팀만 우리 와 지와팀만 못해 다 지와팀만 못해 비행기에서 간다 지와팀만 못해 비행기에서 우리 예서 좀 좋아 지와팀만 못해 비행기다 님바데 레시바 출대는 이봐 이거 레시 좋아 다 손바데 레 마시보다 튀기네 봐. 레 마시보다 튀기네 봐. 이 해서 당가서 나보니 라디티비 괜찮구나.
第七个的意思了
음.
第七个的
이도 얼마.
那时候
지워 좀 뭐 대봐 하세요. 대봐. 다 니가 레시가 주장하듯 진짜 정말 좋아.
那印记打对哦
아니고
那时候 so up to this point so it talks about the three faults mentioned by Buddha Palita if the self and the aggregates were inherently different. So up to the point that person necessarily asserts that person arises as disintegrate inherently. So up to this point, so it talks about the three faults mentioned by Buddha Palita if the self and aggregates were inherently one. So and then in this regard, the entering the middle way auto commentary sets forth three faults. So then from this point onwards, then it talks about the three faults mentioned in the entering the middle way auto commentary by Glorious Chandrakirti. So then the first fault is it would be unreasonable to have a memory of former lives. So this is the first fault. it will be unreasonable to have a memory of former lives. Then the second fault is karma that has been created will be wasted. Second fault. And the third fault is the how to say karma that is not you will meet with the karma that is not done. Fault of so the fault of meeting with actions one has not done. So these are the three faults. I repeat. It will be unreasonable to have a memory of former lives, the first fault. And the second fault is karma that has been created will be wasted. And the third fault is the fault of meeting with actions one has not done. So these are the three faults. Again. So the first one is set forth in entering the middle way, for things to be distinct by their character, but included in one continuum is illogical. With respect to something earlier and something later, so something earlier and something later, the earlier moments and the later moments, so established as distinct by way of their intrinsic natures, a relationship of dependence between what is later and what is earlier is illogical. 일단 난 랑싱이 타대로 해요. 랑싱이 타대, 랑싱이 루나이데, 랑싱이 루나이데, 랑싱이 타대로. 미세기야 랑싱이 타대의 시기요나. 랑싱이 지로. 나서.
그러니까 수수 두고 도자리 그러니까 나마 심을만 좋아요. 그래서 제발 만들어 줘요. 그래서
Yeah, so if the self and the aggregates were inherently one, then it would be unreasonable to have a memory of former lives. So the self, if the self and the aggregates were inherently one, then the self would become inherently it will become inherently existent as well. So if the self inherently exists, then then the previous moment and the later moment of the selves will become distinct. So distinct meaning that so if they are inherently existent, so meaning that they are able to set themselves up. So as it says in the text, so a relationship of dependence between what is later and what is earlier is illogical, since they are established with their own power as capable of setting themselves up. They cannot depend on anything else. So, so if a single mental continuum is therefore illogical, it would be unreasonable to have a memory of former lives. So, if the self inherently exists, then the previous moment and the later moment of the self, so in fact, they are in a continuum, right? So, however, if the self inherently exists, then the previous and the later moment of the self will become distinct. So, distinct in the sense that they are able to set themselves up. Other way of saying this is they are self-instituting by way of its own power. They're able to set themselves up by way of their own power. So, meaning that the later moment does not depend on the previous moment. And there is no more continuum. So there is no more continuum because the later moment does not depend on the previous moment anymore. So in fact, the continuum is a self in the continuum. Then it travels in this continuum, and then it reaches the path of accumulation, path of preparations, and eventually achieve the state of enlightenment. So all these are in one continuum. So however, if self exists inherently, then the previous and the later moment of the self become distinct in the sense that they become capable of setting themselves up by way of its own power. So it doesn't depend on the previous moment anymore, and then there is no more continuum. So just like the Buddha Shakyamuni. So Buddha Shakyamuni, before Buddha Shakyamuni become enlightened, then he was an ordinary being. So then in previous lives, then he was a prince. Then through this continuum, then eventually this person or this self exists. This self become enlightened, and then it become Buddha Shakyamuni. So they are in one continuum. So if the self exists inherently, then this would be impossible. Yeah, so the Buddha Shakyamuni in previous lives, then he was a king, so not queen. Yeah. So he was a king, and then he was a bodhisattva at that time. So that the self of that bodhisattva and the self of Buddha Shakyamuni, they are one. They are of one continuum. Dia tu masyarakat tu bagi tak, ini dia kisah kita, kap dia ini dia ini QG roh.
어, 유지가.
음.
원래서 유지로와.
Ini sini
당연히 부산아.
dia ini tiga orang yang baik.
가사 예세.
So
지원으로 참 예세.
that's all. Yeah. So the as it before Buddha as it, now Buddha Shakyamuni has become enlightened. So the self of Buddha Shakyamuni and the self when he was a bodhisattva. So the self of the bodhisattva in his past lives, then they are in fact in one continuum. So, and because of being one continuum, then it makes remembering past lives possible. So if the self exists inherently or intrinsically, then the previous moment and the next moment and the later moment will become different, unrelatedly different. So if they were unrelatedly different, then the self of Buddha Shakyamuni and the self of Bodhisattva in his previous lives will become distinct or become different. So it becomes unrelatedly different. So if it becomes unrelatedly different, then it will be impossible for Buddha Shakyamuni to remember his past lives by saying that at that time I was a Bodhisattva. So since in in fact, the self of Buddha Shakyamuni and the self of Bodhisattva in his previous lives is one continuum. So they are in fact one continuum. And because of being one continuum, therefore it makes remembering past lives possible.
딱 근데 지와 대번 누마는 어떻게 너무 그러다.
주주가
많이 주야도 지와 대번 되게 많이 해서 진도세.
주주가 심성.
야야.
다,
이들이 제가 그때 너무 들어와.
다라싱이 두나?
제가 왔다 저다 또 자고 그래서 와.
라소.
지와 대번도 좀 자고 그래. 오늘 야스 대기 지와 대번은 뭐 지지도 주도서 지와 뭐 대번 되면 많이 자고 그래. 이미 지타대로 와. 대지다 지지대가 위타대서가 내 소소 자다 지타대 소소 자다서가 지와 대하게 요 말했어. 내가 또 얘기하면서.
And the text says, it will be unreasonable to have a memory of former lives. So in that lives, at that time, I was such and such. So it is like with Devadatta, when he remembers a former life, he doesn't remember I was Yagyadatta, whose mind stream is distinct from this. So Devadatta and Yagyadatta, they are two different continuum. They are two different continuum. So if self exists inherently, then it will be like Devadatta when he remembers the former lives, then he doesn't remember I was a Yagyadatta because whose mind stream is distinct from his. So it will be like this if the self exists inherently. So then this is the first fault mentioned in the Entering the Middle Way auto commentary. If the self were exist inherently. So we stop here.
그거 스스로.
주-
다 그리 대샤고 있어. 야. 스트럭처야. 아무도 비자원 내가 그래. 하나. 그때 봐줘다. 더 공부 좀 중지 비딩 뭐 사실 방에서 이거 때문에 그때 대박이 쇼를 줘봐라. 저기 넘어서 뭐 넘어서 그런 거지. 제가 그리 가봐 주는 시점이 있는데 그냥 가지고 어디 비춰서 뭐 쉬어야 되다. 난 다음에 봐시 돼 이거. 이거 부세가 쉬어. 먼저다 미기라고 그러다 봐시야. 이게 어디 비기가 봤어.
So we conclude with dedication. We dedicate the roots of virtue in general to the teachings and sentient beings. And in particular, we dedicate these roots of virtue to all upholders of Buddha's teachings, mainly His Holiness the Dalai Lama, to live eons long, to have good health, and may all their holy wishes and enlightened activities be accomplished instantaneously and spread in all directions. In particular, we dedicate these roots of virtue to our beloved teacher, Geshe Lama Sopa Rinpoche. We dedicate these roots of virtue for our beloved teacher, Geshe Lama Sopa Rinpoche, the unmistaken reincarnations of Rinpoche be swiftly returned and continue to turn the wheel of Dharma for the sake of teachings and sentient beings, so that we will have the opportunity to receive the precious teachings from you again, Rinpoche. And may Rinpoche's holy wishes be accomplished instantaneously. And we also dedicate these fruits of virtue to the world peace. May excellent happiness prevail in the world. May wars, conflicts, disaster, natural disaster, and etc. be pacified immediately. Sabeke wadi tendang rowa kun la kan pendang kiba jitsun lo san daba yi teme di mori do se je sho. Kyo rinpo che ma ke panang ki kyu chi ke pa nyapa me pa yang kun he tu tong pe wa shu. Wei chi da ke ma dang ku to sambo de ya te shin de te na ku ke je so da lo je ke wa de la da che ra to wa tu ni to rinpo che ma ke panang ki kyu chi ke wa nyapa me pa yang kun he kun to pe wa shu. Ni ta rinpo che ma ke panang ki kyu chi ke wa nyapa me pa yang kun he kun to pe wa shu. Ni je sun do ju be la chi se 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 kan je tin lu ke chan na pe mo te tsing kya so la so wa de so ke de le ro shu wa ne ka de me de ma lu ba ka me ju me sa me ni shin no ka ne su me te tsing kya so la so wa de so tu she le ro shu da me te ma ke se ne ran do lo tang kya wa ya se ku wa che na ja shi ke kya yo ma lu be de de me ma tu be ke se su ko so so be tu de ko chi she da tu be si se be wa la na ya mi shu su be ko cha che su me che se la ma so wa de be de ma tu ju be ko chi ko ye de da ma ju ro wa ye ti du zhen ma ze be mu lo ho shi wa shi de ni le ba we da ju su kya su chi sa da ka she na che du che lo shi de me de be ya sa be ju ke sa tu je be du ju she ju ya we ko ye shin gang de pen da de ma ma tu shi be ne che de so wa de zhen kya zo ye sha be si de ba tu de
我也对去了，那你可是长毛地是修结了结什么？有人是哇结了，看到了，
啊。
你看到我在哪里边境干了，我的不